Good morning, everybody. Thanks to those of you who stuck around from our first session and to all of the newcomers in the room. It's great to see everybody. My name is Michelle Thornton, and I am a faculty member in the School of Business and a former accessibility fellow. And I am part of the campus work group on accessible teaching and practices. And I've got a couple of my colleagues from that committee here in the room, Casey and Carrie, and one of our current fellows, I think, is here too. So it's great to see everybody. If you have never been to any of our sessions on accessibility, I encourage you to go back and watch some of the introductions. Stick around for today, but I think then you'll get some additional kind of insight that I'm not going to go quite into enough detail on. Today's session right now is all about some very specific tactical pieces around accessibility and our new learning management system. And as such, you're going to see a bunch of screenshots where I'm going to walk you through some different processes that I've sort of been learning myself, honestly, over the last month, as I have been part of the summer pilot where we have had the chance to kind of get in there and start playing around with developing content and building our online classes. So with that, I do think it's important that no matter any session we're doing on accessibility, I try and at least talk a little bit about what accessibility is. This is not going to be anywhere near kind of the more lengthy introductions that we do in other sessions. But like I said, those are recorded. And if you're interested in the ideas, go back and watch those as well. So what is accessibility? Many of us are quite familiar with the concept of accommodations on campus, and accessibility is certainly related to that, but I think it sort of flips the idea on its head, right? Accommodations in our courses, either in person or online, are all about taking a specific student and making changes to the content that we're delivering to specifically meet that student's needs, right? So it could be something like extra time on a test. It could also be being allowed to take tests in a distraction-free environment, things that are unique to that student's situation. Accessibility, on the other hand, doesn't require any kind of self-identification or an individual student to disclose their situation, but instead designs our learning spaces with a more inclusive perspective and approach in mind, right? So instead, it's proactive, where we as instructors are building our courses, sharing content, sending emails, all in a way that is accessible to everybody, right? This cartoon that we see here kind of tries to depict that idea by showing that by making a simple change, this person on this campus could have shoveled the ramp before the stairs and therefore allowed both the student in the wheelchair as well as the other students that were walking to go up the wheelchair while he then finished shoveling the steps. But by shoveling the steps first, right, it leaves some people out. So this mindset of starting with the more inclusive approach is kind of what we're talking about when it comes to accessibility. It's super important because while you may not believe it, but 1 in 5 Americans have a disability. Most of those are not visible. So we're not talking about somebody who's obviously visually impaired or in a wheelchair, but oftentimes they are neurological or cognitive disabilities that we may not have any idea about. And I think this is what oftentimes happens with our students and why very often they don't disclose and wind up with accommodations. So on campus, we talk about 5 specific principles of accessibility. In this session, I'm just going to focus on the first 4 because they're the most relevant to Brightspace and actually giving you sort of like a clear look at how to use Brightspace to improve your accessibility. So what I'm showing you here, right? This is a real life thing. I use a lot of checklists in my online courses, and you can see I'm denoting this as a bad example. Okay, so in this case, this is not a separate document. This is something I built directly into Brightspace, and this is before I did anything to make it more accessible. What this sort of section of content is meant to convey to the students, it's the sort of to-do list that they have for a given week, whether it's readings, videos, the kinds of content that they're supposed to be consuming. Okay, so we're going to go through this section. And I'm going to show you how I made it accessible using Brightspace's built-in tools. So the first principle that we always talk about is structured content. And this is identifying headings of certain sections as well as lists And this does two things to us. It makes it more visually easier to organize and process. This is extremely salient and important if somebody has an executive functioning disorder or processes information differently. Even just me, right? Like visually easier to see and understand. But it's also super important if someone is using a screen reader or keyboard assistive technology, because things like identifying a heading of a certain section alerts a screen reader or somebody using a keyboard to be able to kind of jump from section to section using that. So here, we're back in sort of the workspace. And when I'm in Brightspace, you kind of click on that same checklist that I had created. And the first thing I always focus on is identifying my headings. And so, but to start with, I highlight with my cursor the required reading and resources. And keep your eyes open on all these slides for the green arrow. That's where I'm sort of identifying the space that you hit in Brightspace. Top left corner, you hit the section that says paragraph, and then you'll see a drop-down menu. For me, when we're in the sort of like meat of the course, my headings are going to be a heading level 2, and that automatically formats it with the bolding and it enlarges it. But more importantly than that, it tags it as a heading for a screen reader or for keyboard technology, where I could just sort of navigate through using the arrow key. Now, the other thing that I have, right, in a list of readings is a couple items that I want the students to pay attention to, that are sort of like the key things they have to do that week. So there are 2 readings that are required, and this is below that heading that I just put in. And so when I highlight that, I can, like you see in many Word documents or Google, right? Like I'm going to up in that top middle, I'm going to hit the bulleted list. And once I do that, it specifically gives me a drop-down menu, identify it as a bulleted list. And I could have used the numbered list for this as well, but I'm not necessarily too concerned what order they read these in. So the bulleted list is important to do it this way instead of like going into the list and like hitting asterisk and making your own bullets. The reason that if you do it this way, again, it signals to those screen readers and assistive technology that this is a specific grouping of information that's a list. Okay. So you'd click on that. It's going to give us those automatic bullet points. Looks great. It's already looking more organized and easier to read than where we were at before. So that's the structured content feature. Those are really straightforward, very similar, and I think intuitive of anything else that I've worked with, either in Google Docs, Word, or if you were building any kind of online web content. So I'm going to show you the same thing. We're going to talk a little bit about hyperlinks, right? You may have remembered in that first document that I showed with you, I've got 2 places where I'm directing students to go outside of the course. One is to a Panopto video that I recorded, and another one is to a website that would give them more optional content to look at. So when I first put it in, this looks like cumbersome and terrible, right? It's the whole website URL. If I was using a screen reader, it would literally read that entire blue sentence. And like, I don't want to listen to that. I can't imagine anybody does. So what our 5 principles tell us to do is to put that into the name of a like within the context of the document, so the person knows where they're going, they know it's a hyperlink, it's very obvious and visually more appealing and works better with a screen reader. So in this case, we would once again highlight the content that we're talking about. The sort of chain link pops up either here right below it, or there's also the one on top here. So you can see this, just remember that icon of looking like chain link. That always is what you need to do to put in the hyperlinks. When you click on that, little box pops up for you. You put the title in, your link, and then you hit create, and then it comes up in a much more appropriate and easier visually format. So text equivalents, right? So text equivalents are all about images. And originally in my document, I didn't have any images. I got to be honest, I'm not a big, huge image person in my my online courses. I think that students do find them, more visually appealing. But in this particular case, let's say that I decided that I did want to put in an image or a screenshot of, say, the cover of the book that I am assigning. In this case, it might actually be helpful. There's two books for this course. So to alert them to which book the reading assignments are from, maybe this makes sense, right? Now, the thing is, that's helpful for somebody who is not visually impaired, right? And so the way that I would do that, but but we have to remember that we want to make it accessible to everybody, right? An inclusive approach to it. So one of the things that I absolutely love about Brightspace, there's two that I'll point out, but this first one is great. It almost makes it impossible for you to put an image into your course without putting the alternative text in. It's just part of the work process, right? So I'm back in my my checklist document, and I go to insert an image, the top kind of right corner, that like little picture of the mountains. Click on that. And then I add, choose, I had saved the image of the book cover to my desktop. You're going to add that in. And then you can't do anything else without providing the alternative text. So you don't even have to remember. It's required to move forward in the process of adding an image. I think this is a great sort of default that sort of gets us in the habit of doing that. And if you have to do it all the time, no matter what in Brightspace, then maybe you're going to remember to kind of go in and do that in other documents that you're using as well. So in this case, this image is not just decorative because it is actually conveying something. There's the image of the book cover. So I note in my alternative text, image shows the textbook cover, name, title, and author of the book. Okay. Great. So it pops in right here. Again, I'm not 100% sure if I would do this in my regular class, but should I want to provide that additional image, it now has the alt text already built in, nothing to worry about there. Great. So another thing that's important to be thinking about as you're creating content for Brightspace is color contrast. This is also not a thing that I do a lot of, right? Like I don't change the color of fonts or of text, but like maybe I want to get a little creative with this one. And maybe I want to, just for whatever reason, highlight something as being a different color than something else, right? And so the important takeaway here, right, is that if I were to do that, I wouldn't only want to use color in case we have students or individuals that are unable to differentiate between colors. But if I do, I also have to make sure I get the contrast right so that visibly it's able to be seen. This is the second sort of built-in tool that I love about Brightspace, and that is a built-in color contrast checker. And it is another situation where it does not allow you to change a color without first checking the contrast on it. So I will show you how that flies. So let's say again that I decided that I wanted the language below the book cover to match. Maybe I want it to be yellow, or I want it to be the kind of funky teal color, right? So I'm going to highlight the text that I want to change the color on. And this is where I go to the little paintbrush icon, click on that. And let's start with yellow, right? So I decided I'm going to choose yellow. I put my cursor there, and it automatically comes up and tells me, is this a viable contrast given the size of the text and given the location? So yellow text on a white background, you can see right here in small text or in large text, big red X signs does not meet the color contrast guidelines. So that one's a no. So I'm not going to choose yellow. Now, what about the blue? Interestingly here, this one you see that in smaller text doesn't meet the contrast guidelines. But if I were to make it bigger, then this turquoisey color of text would meet color contrast guidelines. The reality is though, other than some sort of like strange aesthetic reason, there's no real argument about why I would want to highlight this section in a different color. But if for some reason that I felt the need to, I have to remember that a screen reader isn't going to differentiate the color either, right? So I may want to put like a note at the end of it, say something like note section is highlighted to, to signify highly important content or something like that, that could provide that cue to somebody else who doesn't have the ability to distinguish colors. Okay. Now, let's say that you, in the last case, what I told you is that choosing the color teal, a small font is not accessible, a larger font is in that. And in this case, I may just want to do a double check. So there is kind of just to make sure that my font was large enough. So what you see here in the middle is sort of like a secondary accessibility check. It's the little I with the check. All right. And if I click on that, what it's going to tell me is in this entire section, if there are any accessibility issues, right? And here, what we find is that the size of this text did not make the teal an accessible font for me. So this is another just built-in kind of way to just kind of go through, double check my work. It doesn't just look for color and contrast and things like that. It's going to look for any other issues that I may have created.
Good, how are you?
Michael, you're not on mute. Okay, great. So I don't know. I don't think I can mute him, but so I think that's super helpful. It allows you to go in and repair or fix it right away as it identifies those issues. Let me move myself back over here. So a couple other built-in things I'm not going to show you, but I do want to tell you about is that there is a built-in math and science equation editor that is accessible as well. This is one thing that I know for my colleagues in math and science, this is something that comes up and that we struggle with. I am told by Casey that there are some limitations to this. It's not, maybe it doesn't have all of the needs, but certainly if you are using a lot of equations and you're building it directly into the content, this is one approach that you can use that, that to be aware of. The other thing is that I get the sense from doing kind of my own research that Brightspace and D2L are extremely focused on accessibility. If you go to any of their communities or their training pages, they have a whole host of content resources, just even their own philosophy that they share that is clearly evident that they have designed this learning management system with an eye on accessibility. So that was encouraging to me. When we think about sort of some of the structural components that us as faculty don't get to like play with or play around with, what this tells us is that they have ensured and worked really hard to make sure that those pieces are accessible as well. Now, I want to talk to you about if any of you are in using Blackboard, have used Ally. This is something that I have preached over and over. I think this is an amazing tool that we have as a campus. Ally gives students alternative formats to documents. So if I uploaded, say, a PDF or a Word document, something like that, it would automatically provide alternative formats like an audio file, things like that. It also, however, would give faculty a course overview with an accessibility score and guide you through the process of fixing any errors throughout the entire course. Whereas the ones that I showed you were just in specific areas of content that you were building. Now, as of today, Ally is not yet plugged into our Brightspace agent, I guess. It is on the list. It's something that we are meant to still continue to have access to, but I can't tell you exactly how Ally is going to look and work and feel in Brightspace as compared to how it looked and felt in Blackboard. So the good news is I think it's coming. The bad news is I can't tell you when, and at this moment in time, I can't give you any insight about how it works. But I would say that Ally is something that I have really been a champion of. And so as soon as we get access to that, that'll be something that you'll see another specific whole session on moving forward. But I think it's also a good reminder that no matter what system you're using, whether it is Blackboard or Brightspace, all of us are uploading other types of content, right? PDFs, PowerPoints, videos, Word documents into our space. It could just be your syllabus, right? And all of those things still need to be made accessible. And oftentimes it's easier to do that outside the context of the learning management system anyway, right? So you may want to use tools like Grackle in the Google Document Suite or the Microsoft accessibility plugins that you can get to ensure that the content that you're creating and that you're just then uploading into the new learning management system is already accessible to start with, right? And that's going to be good best practice no matter where you're at. And even when Ally's in there, oftentimes you have to re-download the document or the content, fix it outside of the learning management system, and then re-upload it anyway. So as you're preparing for the fall, be thinking about all of these accessibility principles in the content that you're creating, whether or not you've got access to Brightspace yet. So last thing that we'll end on is that there are all kinds of just campus-based resources here at Oswego on accessibility, whether it's our accessibility webpage, our faculty accessibility fellows, or a whole host of breakout sessions this spring or archived ones that you can find on our website. We are excited about it. I'm feeling super positive about some of the features that I've seen so far in Brightspace with regards to accessibility. And I am happy to kind of wrap it up there, but I think maybe have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions if anybody has any.
I guess I have a follow-up question. I put it in the chat earlier. You were showing us editing a document that in Blackboard we would have called file, right? So it's going to be an equivalent thing in Brightspace. What was that called?
No, so in Blackboard as well as in Brightspace, you have the ability to create content directly in the course, right? So
yeah, but not uploading a file. It's called, I think it was creating a file, right?
Perhaps, and that's not necessarily how I used Blackboard. So
Okay.
in the case of Brightspace, this was a module within the course called a checklist. Okay, and that is content that doesn't exist in any kind of downloadable file or anything like that. It's just a space within the course itself that shows up as like static content that they can then either click through to other links or, you know, some people.
Right, I understand that. So,
yeah.
But what was it called? I didn't see the moment that
Checklist.
you opened it. What?
A checklist.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's not just the checklist. It's for creating any of the content in Brightspace operates exactly the same way that I told you.
Well, to address the question I asked in the previous session, are you encouraging then people to actually create the actual content in the Brightspace editors to help do all the things that you've been talking about?
Yeah, great question, Anne. Thank you. I think that when it makes sense, you're going to want to create content directly in Brightspace. But there are several things I personally link out to in terms of that I keep as full separate documents in, for example, Google Docs. So I have some of the language from my syllabus in the specific Brightspace like field as well. But then I also link out to a Google document. That way, if a student wants to download that syllabus, they can do that as well. And so that's typically how I approach things. You know, if one of my assignments is a reflection or a writing assignment, oftentimes I'll link out to a rubric outside, but I also put the instructions directly in. So I just know that people, you know, use content differently, and some want those paper options as well. So, but anything that I'm linking out to, I also ensure is accessible. Any other questions before we wrap this session up? Okay. Well, it's great to see everybody. Thanks so much for joining us, and watch for more sessions as we learn more about Brightspace and can really dig into additional accessibility information and usage on that.
Actually, Michelle, it looks like